I would like to make
I have no important points to make. I think the presentations was excellent. One of the problems I have, as soon as you put meaning in terms of quantities, you reduce the nature of the meaning. And yes, there are a lot of elements of redundancy, which is very important in terms of the meaning. But I think you bypass the whole content basically, and that is my worry. And I don't want to make more points in that.
I would like to add one brief comment. I concur with Klaus that it was an excellent presentation. I believe you have resolved several critical issues, at least in my mind, with regard to the mathematics of network theories. And I look forward to studying your slides in considerable detail. It's really an excellent presentation. I congratulate you on your progress in your work.
So I've got a question, and I wonder if I could connect this to both these presentations, because I think there's a question about networks here. And Lucio, I was thinking this in your presentation about, you know, what a network is. I mean, it's an idea, it's a concept, it's a way that we imagine people operate, but it's also an abstraction. And I was very struck by Jerome's comment about probability. That was very, very important. I think that the Bayesian stuff, it seems to me, is incredibly important. And the machine learning community, which I'm sort of partly involved in at the moment, it's astonishing actually how Bayes has kind of taken over that whole game. There's something about networks and probability and measurement. So Lucio, can you tell what is a network?
Oh, good question. I mean, a network is a way to look at relations among elements, whatever the elements are. Can be abstract concept, for instance, a cognitive map is a network, a map of concepts, a map of the relations between disciplines, for instance, in cytometrics, which is one of the elective fields of LUT, for instance, by the way. And so it's a way to look at relations and the structures that are formed by these relations. Okay. So then you can choose. I mean, just as an observer, you can then instantiate a network in so many ways. The only thing you need is a set of elements that you choose and a type of relation or many relations connecting these elements. That's all.
Okay, so this is a question which I've puzzled over for a long time. Can you have an element without a relation?
I think no. The answer is no. In my view, you can have what you can have, for instance, in the physics of gas and then you still have structures, networks, but they are changing so fast in the relations that you consider them random. That's just the difference, because I mean, another ingredient to speak of a network is some kind of stability in the relations. So if the molecules in the gas are continually changing, they're interacting so fast. So then you can skip the network description of reality and use statistical mechanics. But just because they are interacting so fast and changing continuously the context.
Okay, so go on.
Oh, okay. I would add to what Lucio said here just a bit and tie it to Jerome's presentation and his desire to create a dictionary for cybernetics or for social systems. I first encountered this issue nearly 30 years ago, and after 5 years or so, I gave up on it, or we gave up on it, I should say. And here's what I see as the problem. And this traces very directly to Lucille's use of the word elements in the notion of a network. A logician, very famous logician by the name of Quine, states that everything is a variable. To be is to be a variable. And this statement has to be contrast, which is part of standard network theory in a certain sense. Elements in a network, as used by mathematicians, are variables. Quine says everything must be to be is to be a variable.
To be is to be the value of a variable, I think is what he said.
Perhaps you're
isn't it?
right.
So the box is there. So we fill the box.
I suspect both. He uses both terminologies. But the point is that in the development of the concepts involved with numbers, one uses the Boolean logic to develop a quantity. In information theory, any amount of information is a Boolean number. This Boolean number cannot be compared directly with the notion of a chemical element. And this distinction is, of course, that each chemical element has an individuality to it, which reflects physical characteristics of the element, and it has a number to it. So the atomic number is not the same as a Boolean number, and the information in atomic number is different from that in a Boolean number. And it's this distinction then that has caused great confusion in the scientific and mathematical communities. And to give you a very clear example of that is the composition of sentences. In other words, the grammar associated with scientific logic. Bertrand Russell noted that atomic sentences are logically composed into molecular sentences. In other words, Bertrand Russell was using the notion of conjunction to join one statement of fact to two statements of fact. And that sort of conjunction is used in logic is an example of the confusion of terminology that exists among the sciences. And sometimes this is referred to as the silos of communication that exists between different disciplines. And this confusion in terminology between disciplines is rampant. And if you look at particularly Lucille's slides, much of his energies have been putting into making clear distinctions between terminologies in use in standard network theory versus in the social sciences. And that terminology issue is very profound. I separate these two notions in my own work with the notion of scale, that is some quantity, versus scope, the scope of meaning of a term in terms of its relationship to language, to syntax, to semantics. And so this is where a good part of the discussions among the sciences and among the cyberneticians and whatnot is exactly how precisely we choose to learn the language and how we use that language in making the distinctions necessary to separate out different systemic ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Jamie, you had your hand up.
Yes, as a follow-up question, when Jerry said he worked on a lexicon, or the field worked on a lexicon and then they gave it up. So when I read Lud, I see him maybe tacitly talking about communication. So dus the relation, not just purely mathematical, but also as embedded in communicative processes. So then I'm curious, to which extent did people in cybernetics really, when they were working on lexicons, so that's my question is for everyone, were they focusing on communication as it happens in the wild, on the role of reading, writing, talking, listening as processes, the sort of processes, I guess, that Lucio is referring to, that one could capture by statistical dynamics.
Yeah.
But on the same time, maybe not. So I'm asking in general how the field has dealt with that, because I joined you 2 years ago. So I don't have that depth of knowledge yet. And I saw Igor putting up his hand, I think.
Yeah. I think Larry would be quite a good person to address your question there, Jamie, but Bob has got his hand up.
Okay.
Igor, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I'll try to be rather quick and so for Lucio, excellent lecture. I learned 3 ways of quantifying redundancy. I've been using a 4th one in ecology, and I would recommend adding it to the group. The idea being that the Shannon measure is not a measure of redundancy; it's a matter of diversity, and that when you have a network with a sender and receiver, you can decompose the Shannon index into 2 non-zero terms, one of which represents the constraint among the elements, and the other which represents the redundancy or the flexibility among the others. And of course, that it deals very much with natural evolution, because what we find in ecosystems networks is that we don't get any that are all redundancy or all constraint, but rather there's a window of vitality that all the ecosystems tend to cover. And it also tells me I've got to read Luke's book. I'll just say with respect to Jerome's, I really appreciate your directionality. Thank you for explaining the difference between the American and the German university, because I come from Johns Hopkins, which was the first German university in the United States. And anyway, I do appreciate your direction and your emphasis upon ethics and morality and whatnot. It's a very contentious issues. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So Igor, did you have your hand up or not?
I did.
Yeah.
And several comments, remarks, congratulations, of course, to everybody who effort in. But I would like to just maybe go to Mark, to your question, what is network? And I think what we are using is basically a tool with a flaw. We are trying to picture networks as a point snapshot in time, right? Yeah. Which is fundamentally wrong. Networks are dynamics and they do change through time. So instead of basically observing the consequences of the development in networks, which are relations, structures which develop through time, I think it's more important to ask yourself, what are the interactions which do happen throughout the time, and usually because of these interactions, or to enable or to suppress them, you develop structures in the network, right?
Yeah.
And we do not observe the interactions, we do observe structures, which is basically well, you get a picture, but not really a good one. There may be a short comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of my own thinking about this. Jerome.
Yes, maybe just to respond to what Bob just said about the importance of ethics, or responding to my emphasis. And I think this can be found in science. It doesn't have to be arbitrary observation. And in fact, Bob, in your book, you discuss, I think, Elsasser's notion, correct me if I'm wrong, of uniqueness and the problems with putting very complex environments and interactions into a sort of a classical statistical corset, and where we can maybe objectively observe, is the apple falling, or is the earth moving up, and so on. And because of what Igor just suggested about the nature of networks as dynamic systems, when we talk about human networks, we have to include notions like however you want to say it, self-consciousness or autonomy or whatever you want to call it, and you can just compare, say, ants to human beings, as I know the ecologist, recently deceased E.O. Wilson did, where you have a very strict division of labor among ants, which reduces, of course, the complexity. You have a queen that's producing, and then you have worker ants. With us, we don't have, maybe Elizabeth, is not, I don't think she's been producing children for a while. No, but so human division of labor depends on discourse. It depends on the way that we basically aggregate our individual positions. And as Nietzsche was saying, it's about power and subduing. But I think on the other hand, it's also a question about finding consensus to some extent. And so I think this is exactly what requires an ethical view, because again, you can't just describe human agents in connection with another in the same way that you describe molecules.
Mm. Okay. Jamie, I just wonder if we can go back to your question, Jamie, about cybernetics and the range of scope in terms of the cybernetic inquiry about communication.
So there was a little sting in my question, but I didn't, it was subconscious. I've been reading Shannon, that Shannon repeatedly said, I'm talking about two telephones communicating with each other. Yeah. So I'm not talking about human beings. And so that there is this a completely different way on discussing human communication. Just that doesn't use at all any of the Shannon measurements that focuses really on interpretation. And I think I've seen some of that on the Laws of Form conference. Because that interpretation is really about the distinctions that we make, and that communication takes place when the sender and the receiver are able to sit down and compare and contrast their schema of distinctions. And so I'm just curious whether everyone here buys 100% into that appropriation of Shannon, or whether some people are willing to kind of take a step back and say that maybe there is more that needs to be done here, and that Luth is somewhere in the middle, because Luth uses Popper's three-world hypothesis that can be understood as making distinctions between artifacts, but also between self and other, and really focusing on the processes of reading, writing, talking, listening as needing to be discussed on their own terms. And since Richard is here, I can throw in, there is something called Kunian Hermeneutics. That Kuhn himself, Thomas Kuhn, was aware of these interpretive processes taking place in science, and that his talk about incommensurability was really about the struggle to communicate, and that it is a great tragedy that Kuhn was pigeonholed into the position of relativism and therefore had difficulty further developing his position. But I see two hands. So Jerry and Jerome, is that a new hand or an old hand?
It is definitely a new hand.
Okay.
A new hand. Okay, Jerry and then Jerome. Yeah.
Okay, I would like to address the point that Jerome raised and Bob raised with regard to ethics and the role in our understanding of human communication and the relationships both with Bayes' theorem and with the Bateson-Wiener distinction. So let's start with the Bateson-Wiener distinction that Jerome brought up. Wiener's distinction of communication presupposes some form of encoding, followed by transmission, followed by decoding. And in that context, the quote unquote truth value of the communication is open to question, and therefore Shannon included within his notion an error correction term, which allows for our computer systems to work despite large numbers of errors in the communications channels. That's really critical because it also is related to human communication, where you're speaking, writing, talking, and otherwise symbolically communicating, perhaps with your hands. In human communication, there is no mode of correction of the form envisioned by Wiener, but you can get the form of correction of Bateson in the sense of how we understand one another. And this very directly leads to Bob Milanovich's concerns and Jerome's and my own deep personal concern about the relationships between ethics and public policy, public behavior. What good and evil, if you want to reduce it to that level of terminology. So the scientific community, using the communications channel envisioned by Wiener, is a mathematical logical one that is subject to proof theories, et cetera, et cetera. The Bateson notion of communication allows for corrections of communications by back and forth between the two speakers. In other words, social interactions within a social network. Well, on the third case, the question of how this all relates to the sciences, well, it turns out that the chemical sciences develop their own language, their own logic, their own systems of terminology, and their own system of networks, all to facilitate exact communication. And in this context, the exact communication among the chemists depends on the atomic numbers and the particular logic developed for chemical logic. And this chemical logic is radically different from the logic of traditional symbolic logic. In other words, the notion of an atom is different from the notion of a molecule in a way that is remote from what Bertrand Russell thought of atomic sentences and molecular sentences. So there's really some very deep issues involved with Bob and Jerome's notion of how ethics relates to communications theory. And these are not simply resolved as far as I can see. Thank you.
Jerome?
Actually, I was going to refer to what Jamie was saying about Shannon, also with reference to Wiener, but I think that you just made a much more eloquent point that went in a different direction. But maybe just to extend that discussion, I think also another, one could say, instrumental justification or reason for emphasizing ethics is in fact the notion of stability. And again, stability in systems, that could be a cross sort of disciplinary notion. So even social systems require stability. And I think a lot of that in the social sphere has to do with legitimacy and perceived legitimacy. And again, the distinction between human beings and ants. Ants communicate and function largely via certain pheromones. And we hear and we see and reason then abstractly using our linguistic faculties. And so this complicates matters greatly, and I think requires a lot more of this, Larry, as you were saying, this problematization, and even say, in a sense of negative entropy, course correction, where somebody might say, well, actually, I take that back, and that's not actually what I meant, and what I actually meant was this. And so going back to Bateson, he has this notion of symmetrical, complementary, and reciprocal relations. And I think these can exist in large extent, as he was saying, simultaneously, and can to some extent, when there is outside pressure, can reinforce or stabilize one another. And I think the problems that we see in say, Ukraine and other places are when there are quite, when we do lack such institutional, I guess, incursions, where you do see a symmetrical building up of pressure, and there is no then reciprocal or complementary giving or taking. And again, I think this is exactly the type of arena where, whereas during the Cold War, you had a lot of emphasis on the strategic sort of cold calculation, a lot more emphasis on ethics and norms should be made. And I think that a lot still can and will be said in those areas, both in the sort of vulgar press. You have people like Yuval Harari, popular authors, but also I think a lot of very serious, if one doesn't consider that serious science, will be had in that arena.
Okay. Richard, you had your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Well, I put it down because I don't know what our timing is, but there was, building on what was just said. So a friend of mine grew up over at where the atomic bomb was built, and at Los Alamos. And as a young woman, she would go and work there. And there was a rule that you never mention or even say that this was about weapons development. You just don't use that language. So part of that communication has to do with all kinds of social issues of meaning that has nothing to do with science. When I think it was Jerry mentioning about chemists developing a language that's precise for chemistry, I think about reading Bruno Latour's thick description of what it was like observing what went on in a chemical lab with biochemistry. And clarity is the reason you communicate through articles is so you can get the next grant, so you can survive. And what's necessary to get that next grant to survive is not about what's rational. It's not about what's true. So the whole idea of the ethics integrity of this in communication is, I think, critical to that, which is why I have a difficulty with the presentation where we looked at simplifying triadic nodes as one-way relationship between three independent actors. Any communication is both ways because of both the expectations, etc.
Yeah.
There's no one way. And this is where I think a lot of us, where I've heard criticisms about Lut, I still will defend him, because at the root of the data that he had the co-occurrence of three types of people. Now, he did type the people as authors of a paper. One's reasonable to assume that the authors of a paper communicated with one another. It was not one way. They had shared thoughts, they had other things. And while it's an indirect measure of whether or not they actually communicated and whether there were shared norms and whether things were negotiated, it is a reasonable estimation that authors on a paper have some form of interactions, not dependency relationships, but interdependency relationships. So I always have that problem when we simplify these as one way and want to go back to two ways. But I have someone here fixing a well, so I have to get off because I'm holding the dog, Bart. I apologize.
Richard, thank you for that. I wonder if there's something that sits behind Jerry's example of chemistry. Chemistry is really interesting because, yes, of course, chemists have this language now, but it was different before the periodic table. It was different before chemistry had a reliable method of prediction. And it does seem to me that the prediction is a very important element in the scientific discourse. It's of course much harder in the social sciences, but perhaps the equivalent in the social sciences is expectation. And I'm just wondering if there's a connection there between what we consider to be predictive in the sciences and our social expectations, particularly in the way that we communicate. Jamie, you're muted.
Yeah, Jerry had his hand up before.
Oh, sorry.
Me. So let's, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think your point is well taken in the sense of how different disciplines have evolved their languages to describe their ontologies. I chose my words very carefully there. The different languages that have emerged from within the scientific communities are radically different from one another in terms of their formal logics. And this is really a key notion particularly in the cybernetics area of how you use those languages in feed-forward loops and feed-back loops and overall information transfer. But the crucial point here is that the composition of terminologies is different in the different languages. And in physics, the composition of the symbol systems in terms of the inverse square laws of Newton and Coulomb dominate the discourse in terms of quote unquote physical laws. In chemistry, the discourse is dominated by demonstrative language. That is demonstrative in the sense that you can go in the laboratory, take the chemicals off the shelf, do the experiment, and then determine whether that is ontologically significant. Ontologically significant without respect to the epistemology of the science as a whole. On the other side, with the point that Lutz brings out very clearly and very sharply, at least now after this several months of discussion, is he's really concerned about the discursive sciences, not the demonstrative sciences. Mm. And a good part of Lucio's presentation is about the discursive sciences in the network theory it's used there versus network theory as it's used in molecular biology or in chemistry, where you're dealing with a demonstrative science that you can go into the laboratory and do with your own hands. And as an experimental chemist for 10 years, I have done it in that sense. And that is still different from the abstractions used in physical laws and the notion of legal behaviors. And so there's vast confusion in language usage here that the philosophers are tangling with and entangled with. And when I read philosophy journals, I feel much like a kitten playing with a ball of yarn. They twist and turn the ball of yarn into a god-holy chaotic mess. Okay.
Okay.
So, discursive languages, demonstrative languages, and then physical language.
All right. Okay, Jerome?
Maybe let Lucio speak, since actually I've been blabbering on and on here and he hasn't spoken very much.
Okay, Lucio?
Okay, just connect with Igor and Jerry interventions. I mean, yes, networks are dynamics. Real networks are dynamics, of course. We use static representations because they can take a picture in a certain moment of time, and that picture anyway can tell us a lot of things, even if it's static and not dynamic. But of course, they're dynamic. So what's the point? The point is that to run a dynamic network analysis, you need, I mean, there is a branch of network analysis, which is dynamics. But in my opinion, it's, I mean, it's not worth using that tool, that approach, because agent-based simulation modeling is much far more powerful than dynamic network analysis. So in my opinion, there is a big jump. I mean, you using dynamic network analysis, you have to make a lot of effort in terms of data and still being constrained by the lot of limitations. If you jump to agent-based modeling, then you can really have dynamic networks. And I could say as rich as you can design it. But then the limit is that you can make a very complex model, but then it's too complex to understand the results. So the question is a sort of epistemological trap. That is, the design somehow is easier than to interpret the results. So you have to balance the two. But then coming to what Jerry said, that's exactly the point of that. I mean, an agent-based model is the laboratory of the social scientist.
Yeah.
So you can simulate and test your theories, your hypotheses exactly, and even more than what you can do in a laboratory, because you can make also extreme, test extreme hypotheses that you cannot do in real life. So it's extremely powerful. And in that point, the two sciences are moving in the same way, demonstrative and discursive at the same time.
This is very similar then to, I mean, it's almost a sort of Herbert Simon type thing, that you've got this sort of dualist relationship between measurement and modeling. Do you see it like that? It's a dance always between these.
Sorry, what's your question precisely?
I'm saying that you seem to be articulating a kind of dualist relationship between modeling, which is a dynamic process of vivifying hypotheses and assumptions, and measurement, which is where you would actually go to the world and actually take a snapshot.
Yeah, into the language of agent-based modeling, that's the work of calibration.
Okay.
That's when you make the calibration of your model. It means that you are giving to your parameters some values that you maybe recollect with an empirical study in reality. So, and you are trying to calibrate your model. But that's only one part of the story, because you can even totally overlook the question of calibration, and you can be interested only to extreme situations, extreme points. I mean, it's your laboratory, and it's a laboratory, how to say, without boundaries.
Yeah.
Just because it's just the boundaries are in your capacity to balance the complexity of the model and the complexity of the analysis of the results of the model.
Okay.
So if your model is too rich, too close to reality, then already you have the reality. You don't need the model, but you cannot understand it.
Gerard put up his hand.
Can I make I did want to make my point. I wanted to give Lucio it's okay?
But Gerard hasn't spoken too much, if I may.
Okay.
Gerard?
Thank you. I'm not really going to contribute something new to what is being said, but I would like to refer to one of my experiences, which is close, I think, to Jerry's. I've had to advise thousands of studies as a research methodologist. And one of the principles, of course, was already expressed by one of my teachers, Patrick Sutcliffe. If you know what you are talking about, then you can measure it. So he was very clear that it is always possible to measure something, but first you have to identify what you're talking about. And so what Lucio, for example, was talking about was his model of a network, not of a network, but of the model of the network that he explicitly demonstrated in his slides. So as soon as it is possible to make something a model, you can measure. because the muscle is always closed, and therefore you can apply some kind of representation. The major point, of course, is every time, why would the thing that you are looking at be just that thing that you think that it is? It isn't. You know, it's very easy. I've told my students thousands of times. It's easy to measure love. No, it's not easy. It's just something fuzzy. No. As soon as you have a model of love, you can measure it. But that doesn't mean that your model is the same as love. So I think the major point is very often that there is a confusion about what mathematics is. It's always about mappings. And mappings are not single things. It is something to something else. And that is the case that you have to know both things, otherwise you can never map. So that's my simple contribution, referring to Patrick Suppes. Know what you're talking about and you will have no problem.
Okay. Okay, so we've got Inga and Jerome. I can't remember who was first now. Inga, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Mark. As it's our final session.
Could you speak
firstly,
in your microphone? Because it's very
yes.
hard to hear you. Very close, yeah.
And now, is it okay?
A little better, but still very quiet, yeah.
I will try to speak louder.
Yes.
As it's our final discussion, first of all, I would like to thank Lud for this book, because this is a great step into the development of theory of communication. Also would like to thank all the discussants for the sessions, and today's discussion forced me to another question, because Lud in his book provides the approach that anticipates the future of communication, the theory of communication studies. But the future of the studies depends on the central problematics. And usually we, by the central problematics, understand intuitively understandable things like knowledge-based innovations, like communication studies and something like that. But to my mind, we also have to think about some distant fields, like, for example, market price movement and some common disease like COVID-19. We don't discuss these things in the frame of communication studies and communication theories. What do you think about it? What type of distant fields could be enclosed to the framework of this communication studies?
In terms of understanding communication generally, do you mean, or understanding scientific communication?
From the point of view of scientific.
Okay.
Scientific point of view.
So, well, I suppose one of the things, I'll have a go at this, but I mean, I suppose one of the things that we haven't talked about is the importance of Niklas Luhmann to Lote's work. And I think within Luhmann's theory, there is quite a clear articulation of why it is that we have different communities, different fields, different people with different languages and so on. Do you see a limit to that? Do you see a limit to is it possible to have a scientific field that cannot communicate with others?
If we talk about numerical studies, quantitative calculations, the limits could be only in available statistics, but some types of statistics could be achieved. And from this point of view, we can could we could add this type of information to the further research. It's just some thoughts about the further development of the theory.
I mean, there's one thing that I think is really important, is that it's very hard to communicate if you can't codify your knowledge. And there are fields of knowledge which are quite hard to codify. Art particularly, I think there's some very complex, and computer programming, strangely, can be quite hard to codify. There are lots of skills.
What about if Jerome gives it a go?
Yeah.
Jerome?
Thank you. And maybe before more people leave, I just wanted to also thank our hosts and moderators, Jamie, Margareta, and well, Jamie/Margareta and Mark. So thank you all for sort of putting the strings together and, you know, keeping us coming back here and organizing. I know that's sometimes not the easiest work and the most rewarding. And actually, I wanted to refer back to two comments that you both respectively made. Mark, I guess first yours, you were talking about in social sciences, expectations as being a form of anticipation. So this goes back a few minutes. And I think this goes into the recent debates into ergodicity and non-ergodicity that have been coming out of, for instance, the London Mathematical Lab there with Orla Peters and others. I think there's a lot of promising research there. Maybe we can bring them in actually and sort of connect to those discourses. And I think I would refer to an observation that I think Keynes made at one point, where he suggested that the way people behave, at least in the economy and perhaps in other environments, is that they expect change. They expect change to occur, but then in the end, they basically anticipate that the future will, in fact, be like the present. So in practice, in theory, they do expect things to change, but in practice, you know, well, I don't know how. So in fact, I'll go back to my default frame that tomorrow will be like today. And also, there's some science that's suggesting that people do not behave in a way that it refers to geometric discounting, of course, that economists assume, but in fact that there's a type of quasi-hyperbolic where we look at today and then we look at all sort of, you know, tomorrow, the day after, the next year. So that seems to be how some neuroscientists feel that we actually do discount the future, which has to do with anticipation. And I would just, to that, refer to one last thing, which I guess refers to Lutz's notion of the selection mechanisms. So when you have markets that use prices with commodities and so on, this type of hyperbolic discounting might, in connection with that, lead to a lot of consumerism. You know, the marketing industry makes, you know, manipulates this or makes use of that in terms of instant gratification. Another type of a selection mechanism, like planning, of course, might allow the normal human being also to extend their frame of reference when they discount the future. But of course, that problematizes, you know, who is doing the planning, and so there are questions of legitimacy there. Also, to Jamie's point, much further back about communication and whether it's something separate, I think the fact that you see Facebook and others monetizing people's communication shows that you can, you know, make a distinction there. So a very, very simple point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I see Lutz.
Yes.
So I thought
that fits. I just wanted to say that I enormously enjoyed all your participations. I learned an enormous amount of things. It's precisely what I meant, and particularly with Mark, that we would organize something which makes it possible for people to encounter. And that precisely, that's what theorizing is about.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. It really has been, it's been a real privilege to do this, to be honest. And yeah.
You filled it out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And also Jamie, fantastic. Okay, all of you, thank you so much. For me, I'm leaving the meeting.
Okay, then I see Luciano. We haven't heard you today.
No, that's right.
And that applies also to Andres and Gabriel. Luciano.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. I was really busy, but I can lost this final session of this wonderful work during this year. Thank you.
Andres?
Well, for my part, I will echo the sentiments of others in the group here. This has been really engaging and really interesting to hear, to be a part of, although I've been silent these last weeks. I greatly enjoyed this, and I greatly enjoyed reading Luke's book, and it's been a privilege to be here. So thank you very much.
Yes, and I would like to repeat, this, all the sessions are recorded and made available at the Club of Remy, and we'll send out the final email with links to all the videos. And I give it back to you, Mark.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much, everybody. I've got a bit behind in sending the videos around. So last time's video is just about to go live, and we'll get this one out pretty quickly. But this is great. This is really, you know, it's so interesting, really, what the technology allows us to do. But to bring such an amazing group of thinkers together and to focus them on an amazing intellectual accomplishment, which we've got in this book, I think is a special thing. I'm sure we'll all sort of look back on this and think, actually, this is a good thing, very good thing. So thank you.
All right. Is this goodbye then, or is this hello again?
Well, I know that there are plans to do something around Bernard Scott's book, and I don't know what the arrangements. Do you know anything about this, Jamie? Who knows?
Yes,
Jerome, perhaps.
Yeah, the little bit that I know, it starts on the second week of September, and instead of the third week, it will be the second week of every month. And it will be at the same time as we do. And there has been already an announcement that went to the Cogitata, and I'm assuming there will be another one once they have finalized who will be the presenters. And it is a testimony to what we did, because some people were a little hesitant whether people would show up month after month, but clearly we managed to pull together every time like a minimum of 6 people. So thank you everyone for being such wonderful and engaging participants, and I learned a lot also.
I would just like to add to the overall conclusions that first, thank you, Mark and Margarita, for doing a superb job of organizing and getting it together. I really think you did a fine piece of work, and the comments here follow. In addition, we ought to thank Jason and the Club of Remy for making their contributions to making it happen on the technological level. So thank you all. I greatly appreciated the discussions.
Great. Thank you very much.
I would like to underscore that again. Thank you for Jason, who originally started the Club of Remy with weekly sessions, and who made this session possible, and who's hosting it. And it was his energy, his commitment that really started this ball rolling. And we should, I don't know whether he's hearing us right now, but to do a big applause, because he really offered the hard, boring work of just putting it all up and doing all the administrative work. And also a thank you to Mark, because he's doing the editing of the videos. And I know from personal experience that it is also tedious and boring. And
that's why I put it off.
All right.
All right. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll see you soon with a new book. But thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.